All right, guys, we've been talking about nutrition and nutrients and the digestive system. So we're going to really go in deep on macromolecules and their building blocks. All right, so let's go ahead and define macromolecules. Macromolecules, remember macro meaning big, right, and complex. Macromolecules are organic compounds built of smaller molecules called building blocks. You can think of this like a Lego castle. So, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, right? Those are like the big Lego castle, meaning they're these big molecules built of tiny little individual Legos, right? So we see here this picture shows us that protein, lipids, and carbohydrates are built of these individual Legos called amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugar. And I tried to use color coding to show the macromolecule and their building blocks. So our digestive system breaks down carbohydrates, lipids, and protein into their building blocks, right? So our digestive system takes this big castle, right? That's in our food, and it's going to break it down into individual Legos, right? So that it can fit inside of our bloodstream and then travel to all of our cells and actually be able to fit through that cell membrane, right? Which is really, really, really tiny. So we're gonna go ahead and highlight our digestive system breaks down carbohydrates, lipids, and protein into their building blocks. And these building blocks, right, they might get used for energy, or they might be used they might be reassembled and actually built into a new part of the body. So we're going to go into detail in a little bit, but we're just going to make sure and clarify that we understand our macromolecules and what their specific building blocks are made of, right? So we take protein right here. Sorry, did not mean to highlight that. Okay, we have our protein right here, and enzymes are going to break those down into amino acids right here. Okay, so the building block of protein is amino acids. So if this castle is protein, then these are the amino acids, right? Lipids, enzymes break those down into something called fatty acids. So if this is that big lipid, if you're eating butter or oil or something like that, then your body needs to break it down into fatty acids. Last but not least, we have our carbohydrates, right? Or our sugars. And so enzymes are going to break those down into something called simple sugars, which we know one common one is glucose. Those are not the only simple sugars, but it's the most common simple sugar. So if this is a huge carbohydrate, you're eating a piece of bread or that Texas Roadhouse roll, then your body is going to break it down into individual simple sugars. All right. We're now going to focus on what our cells actually use the amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugars for. And there's two options here. The first one is to use it for energy. Okay, so we're going to use those fatty acids and the simple sugars specifically for energy. And this is because if you look at a molecule of glucose, let's take a look over here. Okay, you see those lines? I'm going to highlight one for you right there. See those lines in between? There's actually chemical energy stored up inside of those bonds of glucose. All right, that chemical energy is stored in those bonds. And when these bonds are actually broken apart, that will release energy that's going to be transferred to ATP. So we're going to go ahead and highlight that chemical energy is stored in between the bonds of the molecules. Okay, and we're going to say when these are broken, energy is released and transferred to ATP. So this is actually how we take glucose, and we're going to kind of break those bonds, and that energy gets transferred to ATP. Okay, so I made this diagram to kind of show this, right? Actually, what happens is the glucose will go to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria, which is kind of shown right here, right? The mitochondria actually breaks those bonds in glucose, releases that energy, which is then transferred to ATP. And then ATP can be used to stay alive and do all of the life processes necessary to stay alive. All right. So usually simple sugars and fatty acids will be used for energy. Typically, amino acids are not going to be used for energy. All right. And amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Okay. So there's a second option because there's only two options that our body will do with those building blocks: amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugars. They will, like I said, number one, use them for energy, break up those chemical bonds in between them, and release that energy to ATP. But the second thing that's really cool is something called synthesis, which we've talked about before. Okay, we're going to highlight synthesis of new materials. Oh my gosh, struggling today. All right, so it's going to take those amino acids, those simple sugars, and those fatty acids and build your body with it. We're going to highlight it will take the building blocks, amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugars, and reassemble them back into a new molecule for the body. I want you to think of this like that Lego castle, if you remember. This is like if your body, right, it's going to take that castle, which is a protein, lipid, or carbohydrate. You will digest it down into individual Legos. So it's like if you had a castle and you took all those Legos apart, you had your individual Legos, and then you decided, I want to build a boat with it this time. So you're going to take those same individual Legos, you're going to put them together and build a boat, right? So that's actually what your body does with those building blocks, is they will take those building blocks and reassemble them into something new for the body. I want you to just take a note at this picture right here, because a lot of times in the Regents exam, they're going to depict synthesis and digestion by showing you an image similar to this. So remember that if it's synthesis, you're making something. So you're taking those individual building blocks and putting them together. So if we look at this picture, that's actually what's happening here, right? We have these shapes and you end up with those shapes connected. And then just a reminder that digestion is the opposite. It's breaking things apart. So that's kind of taking that castle, right, and breaking those bonds down into little individual components. Sorry, guys, I have these a little bit out of order. So let's take a look to see just specific examples of how the body is going to take those building blocks, amino acids, fatty acids, and simple sugars, and reassemble them and put them together into parts of the body. All right, so let's take amino acids, for example, which is the building block of protein. Don't forget that. We're going to go ahead and highlight this just so we can separate that. So notice that we have these individual amino acids. We're going to synthesize them into this protein right here. Okay, and so when they're synthesized back into a protein, this is going to be a protein that the body has. So let's show an example, right? Let's say you eat a steak, right? Your digestive system breaks those down into amino acids. Those amino acids go to your bloodstream, which then go to your cells. Let's say they go to your hair cells or your skin cells, right? Well, your hair cells and your skin cells will take these amino acids and make collagen, right? Which you've probably heard of, which is a protein in the skin. It could make keratin, a protein in the nails, and actually elephant tusks are also made of keratin as well. It could make hemoglobin, which is a protein on red blood cells that will carry oxygen. Some other examples are, we've been talking about enzymes, which are actually proteins. So your cell might take those amino acids that it got from your food and then put them together to build an enzyme or something called an antibody that is in your immune system. Let's take a look at fatty acids. Okay, so fatty acids, which once again, those are the building blocks of lipids or fats. And fatty acids kind of look something like this. They're a bit bigger than amino acids. I talked about them having a lot of bonds, so they have a lot of energy inside of them. Those are individual, right? Those are the building blocks, and they're actually put together to build this structure right here. Okay, so examples of that in the body. Our hormones like estrogen, progesterone, those are going to be built of lipids or fats. So our body, our cells will take those fatty acids and then build hormones. Another option, actually, the cell membrane is mainly built of fats. So the cell will take those fatty acids and actually make them into the cell membrane. We have myelin sheath around our nerves, which allows our cells to communicate. Just different parts of the body, our cells, our organs, right? And so that myelin sheath is actually mainly made of fat. It's kind of like the outside of an electrical cord that will allow a signal to send. So that's really important. That's really why we need healthy fats in our diet. And I put on flubber here just because if we know those Arctic animals, whales, for example, orcas need that flubber for insulation. And so they need fat, right? They need to store fat so that they can stay warm in those cold waters. Last but not least, we have our simple sugars, which are the building blocks of carbohydrates, right? So you eat a piece of bread, for example, and you break it down into little tiny simple sugars. And those simple sugars are going to synthesize into this big chain of carbohydrates. And so we already know what our body, how our body does this. It does this, for example, for glycogen in the liver. The glucose molecules are stored as glycogen. Actually, in plants, their glucose molecules will be stored as starch. Okay, so another option I told you guys before is that cell membrane receptors, like insulin receptors, are actually typically built of carbohydrates. So the cell might also take those glucose molecules and build cell membrane receptors from it. Let's go ahead and actually summarize what we've been talking about. First, I'm sorry, we're going to talk about enzymes really quickly. We're going to talk about enzymes over the next few days, but for today, we're just going to introduce them. And so you might be wondering, how does our body actually break things apart and then also glue them together, right? And that's actually through a molecule called enzymes that we've been talking about. What's kind of cool is enzymes actually don't only digest things, they actually will also put things together. So we're going to go ahead and highlight. We use enzymes to digest and synthesize molecules. So every chemical reaction that happens in the body requires a specific enzyme in order to work. For example, if you want to break down starch, a carbohydrate, you need an enzyme called amylase. That's actually in our saliva. But if you want to break down a different sugar, lactose sugar, like in milk, then you need a different enzyme called lactase. So each thing that you're breaking down or putting together requires a different enzyme that is specific to whatever they're breaking down or building. We like to refer to enzymes as a catalyst because they speed up chemical reactions. I like to think of this as like a catapult, right? So enzymes actually speed up chemical reactions, which allows the digestion and synthesis to occur. Just some quick tips about enzymes are that they are protein, meaning they're built of amino acids. Enzymes bind to other molecules to break or build molecules in the body. They are something called biological catalysts by speeding up chemical reactions. And enzymes are actually produced inside the cell in the ribosome, which is an organelle that makes proteins. All right, I'm actually not going to go over this summary table. I'm going to have you go over it on your own, but that is a summary of the macromolecules in the body, what their purpose is, which we talked about earlier, their building blocks, and then some examples of specific macromolecules. All right, so you can go over that on your own time.